Shio, Ayodazam. Welcome to the Red Road East. I am your host, Feerce Truth-Seeker. So, I did tell you all that the next time we have a show, I would have a treat for you. Okay. And today we have a guest who is no stranger to the studio. Our guest has appeared on the show previously, and unfortunately, our guest didn't have a whole lot of time to expound upon her diligent research and information that is very crucial, critical, and beneficial to those of us here in the West. Okay, so today's show, we're going to be discussing the Amerindian Moorish connection. Okay, and our guest is Dr. Fatou Diarra. Dr. Fatou, welcome back.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.
How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Great, great. So, the last time you were here, you had a little bit of time. I think it was between you and Brother Obashango, and you only had
Yes.
15 minutes, and you were on a roll. And
Mm-hmm.
told the viewers we definitely have to bring you back. And so
Mm-hmm.
you're back with us to share the wealth
Yes.
of information that you have been uncovering. And
Yes.
so we want to hear what it is that you have. And I know that since the last time that you were on the show, you've come across even more information. So
Absolutely.
tell us what you have discovered.
Well, let me just start off by saying that the last time, not to waste too much time talking about what I spoke about previously, we talked about DNA, and I told your listening audience I learned a tremendous a lot about population genetics from Tyrone Lewis Cannon and Toriana Obashengo L. And one of the things Tyrone Lewis Cannon points out is that he talked about, particularly with North American Aborigines, now called African Americans, the small amounts of Southeast Asian DNA, which are Austronesian markers. Okay, and that's evidence of the one of the earliest seafaring people to come in on us, and how that, if anything, the fact that 99.5% of us, if not 100% of us, actually have those markers is evidence that our ancestors, or a good portion of them, had to be in situ to receive those seafarers. And the fact that those markers are so pervasive is evidence of that. Okay, so that's just one aspect of our ancestral composition. There are other aspects to our ancestral composition, because Austronesians were not the only people to come here, as we know. And one of the things that I've come to realize is that the Berbers, the North Africans, and the Phoenicians, which ties into the Berbers because there is a connection via Carthage. And Carthage was the daughter of Phoenicia in North Africa, and they had different city states all over the Mediterranean. And when you start doing DNA studies using different programs like GEDmatch, and you start looking at Afro American, so called African Americans and Caribbeans, and people from Central and South America, you start to see common features. Now, when it comes to population genetics, DNA, it is not something that's perfect. It's far more complex than I know. Okay, it's a field of study within and itself. But what you pay attention to are you pay attention to the patterns. Okay, and it's very helpful when the more people that participate, the more you get to see patterns. So I would say in 2021, the good thing is that globally, people all over the planet, they're participating, which means that we get to see definite patterns. And there are certain patterns that are quite unique to our people here in the Americas. And when we look at these patterns, now let me just say this: where am I going? There's a new field, relatively new, called archaeogenetics in terms of its relationship to population genetics. And this is becoming increasingly popular. And that basically is a field of study where they look at different archaeological ancient sites, and they are able, through modern techniques, to extrapolate the DNA and map out the DNA sequencing and map and compare modern populations to those ancient sites. Well, looking at this is an example of what we tend to see. This is an archaeogenetic group called My True Ancestry. There are thousands of members from all over the globe: Europe, Asia, different types of Europeans, and we even have some Africans, continental Africans, that are participating. Now, this is a typical breakdown of what we see when we are looking at the results of Afro Americans, African Americans, or African Caribbeans, or even people from South America, what we call Afro Latinos. This is what we typically see. Now, one of the things that came to mind that I noticed is that when you look at those results outside of the Bantu, Yoruba, and the Khoisan, you will notice you see groups primarily throughout the Mediterranean and going into Russia. And this was something that I noticed particularly with our people here out of the Americas. And this was not something seen necessarily with all Europeans. If you look at the color code, circular code of many participating Europeans, of course, this depends on what type of European you will see. It's totally different. They will match to, let's say, Franks, Gauls, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, and Anglo-Saxons, maybe sometimes Celts, and there will be some overlapping groups that we will match to them with. Some of us will match to Celts as well, and of course, we know Celts were not a monolithic people, neither were Vikings. But the group that we match closest to out of Europe in terms of common groups are Mediterraneans. That would be the people from Italy, Greece, and Spain. Now, the question becomes, when we do traditional DNA tests like Ancestry and whatever other groups, why is that not being reflected? Well, one of the things that I started noting, the same way they cover our Native American markers. Now, the way they cover it is that they change the criteria for what is reported. Okay, no, we're not
Yeah, I
Native
noticed that.
American. Okay, so but the presence of pervasive Native American markers speak to the fact that we were here prior to Columbus, and there had to be extensive genetic exchange, and that is the issue. So maybe before they would have maybe 1% as their criteria for reporting, then all of a sudden now it changes to 3%. So that, of course, eliminates a whole lot of people from having that being reported.
Dr. Fatou, I would, for the sake of the viewers, I want you to just backtrack just a tiny bit for the for clarity and talk about, you just mentioned the 1% and 3% with regards to the DNA. Now, what does that mean? Like when the companies say you have 1% or 0% does that have to do with how much Aboriginal blood you have, or does it mean that your blood on the land goes back far? Just elaborate on that point for the sake of clarity for the viewers, and then pick up from there. Wait, on the last point, which was along those lines.
Okay, well, basically, it is a percentage, but
Mm-hmm.
what we know in general, the smaller the percentage, the more ancient the presence.
Okay, yeah. And the reason why I asked that is because, like, say for instance, like a lot of people refer to Henry Louis Gates and his documentary that he did, and he stated, that people that had less than 11% were not really Native American, this, that, and the other. That's the reason why I asked you that question, so that you could clarify that.
Right. But see, we're not claiming to be Native American. Okay. We're not claiming to be Asiatic descendants. And they also came here. We're indigenous to the land. And we have a total different ancestral composition from the.
Now, when you say we, you're referring to.
I'm referring to people that are now called African American, Caribbean, Afro Caribbeans, South Americans, Afro Central Americans, also called Afro descendants, that are erroneously tied as having their primary ancestry out of the African continent. Now, I'm not saying we don't have genetic ties to the African continent, because that would be inaccurate, but we are actually indigenous to this land.
Okay. I just wanted to, so I know there will probably be some confusion on the end of the viewer, so I just wanted you to clarify that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Do you want to pick up where I left off?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what I was talking about is that for many of us, when we start talking about indigenous studies using genetics, the slant has been to look at the amount of Native American tiny markers, even though we're not Asiatic descendants. But there has been total negligence of our link to North Africa, our link to Europe, and it is actually far more extensive than the Asiatic presence. And if you look at DNA studies, not your conventional DNA studies, but when we upload our raw data to other companies, and I talked about archaeogenetics, where it's a growing field where you have ancient burial sites, and our DNA is mapped to those sites, and they look at the sequences and what you share in common, okay, with those ancient sites. What we're seeing a definite pattern, and we're seeing a pattern that so-called African Americans, Caribbeans, South American, so-called Black people, we are matching heavily to Neolithic European sites, and particularly sites in the Mediterranean. And this is not being reflected in the traditional DNA studies that look at the European aspect. Now, we have a tendency to ignore the European aspect, but it should not be ignored, because what they're focusing on is what took place maybe in the last 300 years. So for those of us from North America, the British primarily was in our yard in the last 300 years. So they will show North Atlantic DNA heavily, totally ignoring the DNA from Europe prior to that. But what's happening is that when you start doing archaeogenetics, what's happening is that our people are matching heavily sites in the Mediterranean, particularly out of the Iberian Peninsula. And we also see this when we are doing, I would say, less biased programs, although there's always bias in all of these programs like GEDmatch, Ancestry, but I would say GEDmatch is a little less biased. So when we upload our DNA to GEDmatch and these other things, what we're seeing is Iberian DNA. We're seeing DNA from West Asia, the area that we now call Syria, Jordan, Lebanon. We're seeing North African DNA. When we also use other programs like Jadrosia, which looks at ancient DNA, we have a decent percentage of Natufian DNA, and these were very early hunter-gathering people in the area now we call Levant, who were very much related to the Maurusian people, who were the progenitors of the Berbers in North Africa. Okay, and you will see that we have a decent percentage of Natufian DNA. So those are all of the things that we're starting to see. So going back to the archaeogenetics, what I was pointing out before was that you have a lot of different people all over the world now participating, which gives us an opportunity to look at patterns and definite patterns. So many of the Europeans that participate, especially from the Northern European countries, they will get matches to Visigoths, okay, Ostrogoths, basically Germanic tribes. We're not matching to Germanic tribes. On occasion, some of us will get like Ostrogoths. But if you look at who we are matching to, it's the same populations. Outside of the main components that they list, our basic components would be Khoisan, Bantu, and then they have something called Yoruba. Outside of that, what you're going to see will be Roma Hispana, and that was Spain under the Roman occupation. Moor is right there up at the top, and Moor, by definition, would be the Berbers of North Africa. They, in this particular archaeogenetic group, they define Moor. So this is not up for debate. Moor means dark skin. No, 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 no. They are very clear. These are Moorish grave sites in Spain that our people in the Americas are matching to. We are matching to those bones. Now, some people will match before Moorish grave sites before Roman Hispania. Some of us match the Roman Hispania a little bit more before the Moorish grave sites. It really doesn't matter, but we're matching to those sites. Then we're matching to the Sumerians. The Sumerians pretty much was a Turkish Asiatic group in Central Asia. And if you look at participants from Russia, from the areas of Uzbekistan, and I have seen their results, they have strong Sumerian matches and Hunnic matches. We also match to the Chola dynasty, which has Tamil, combination Tamil, South Asian, Southeast Asian. We're all getting Chola dynasty. We match heavily to the Huns, very heavily to the Huns, for Asiatic people who were very much related to the Mongols. We're also matching to the Proto-Hungarians. So I will tell you, these groups that I just named, we all match heavily. Now, the criteria to be considered a DNA match is different than your traditional DNA matches that people that they allow with, let's say, GEDmatch. The archaeogenetic section has a cutoff, okay? Now, because these are very ancient samples, they had to give more leeway. So to be considered a match, they had to have like 1.5 what they call centimorgans, which is their what they use to measure chromosome length, and a minimum of 60 snaps, which is single nuclear polypeptides. So that is their minimum. But then there's something called ancient relatives with this particular group. Now, ancient relatives would be DNA matching segments, but they are larger. So in other words, we have more confidence. And I can tell you that the so-called Afro-Americans and Caribbeans that are participating, when you look at their ancient relatives, who are they? Who are we overall matching to? Well, we don't match to the same ones because some people have more of a connection than others. But in terms of ancient relatives, many of us are matching to Grenada, Cordoba site, more Cordoba, Grenada. We're matching.
Are you referring to Grenada or Grenada, the Caribbean island?
I'm referring to I'm sorry, I mispronounced it. My apologies. Grenada in Moorish Spain. We are matching to those Moorish sites. Some of us don't have enough of a strong genetic marker to meet the criteria for ancient relative, but they are definitely ancient matches. Then some of us, like in my mother's case, my mother has a lot of ancient relatives matching to Hunnic and Sumerian, which is
Now this, I'm sorry, this ancient relatives, is that the name of the DNA company?
no, the name of this particular DNA company is called My True Ancestry. And
My
so
true ancestors.
basically, they regard all what they call deep dives, all DNA. See, right there, I'm glad you put that up. All of those colors right there, these are all genetic DNA matches, meaning that according to them, you share matching DNA segments, and all of these people, if you trace it back, you share common ancestry. Okay, and if you look, I know it's blurred. If you look, you have the Khoisan at the top, who were the earliest inhabitants all over the planet. Then you have their Bantu. Then you have Yoruba. Okay, and then you have Roman Hispana and Moors. Some of us will have Moors before Roman Hispana, and then underneath that you have it looks like Guanches. Guanches were a Berber people in the Canary Islands. We all have that. Proto-Hungarians, we all have that. Huns, Avars, I've seen all of us with that. The Sumerians, who were a Turkish type of people who were intermixed with the Asiatic population, we all have that. Then you have the Greco-Bactrian. Then you have the, underneath that, Byzantine Empire. I see all of that with our people. Now, this is very interesting because not everyone from Europe will get this. They will get this. And we are all matching either Phoenicians or Carthaginians. But if you study the history, you will learn that these areas outside of the Russian area, these areas pretty much were, especially in the Mediterranean area, they were under Phoenician control. And Carthage was a daughter of Phoenicia. Okay, so that does link to us.
It's funny. I'm sorry. It's funny. What you're saying sounds very much like what a man by the name of Prophet Noble Drew Ali said way back in the beginning of the 1900s.
Okay, I was told that he said something like this. Yes.
Yeah, he was saying that we were Moors and that we had all of these different connections. So I'm just throwing that in because what you're saying sounds very similar to the things that he was saying way back then without the DNA to back it up. But now you're using the science, and it's very interesting.
Yes, well, the DNA is definitely supporting that. And you will see this is a very repeated pattern with those of us from the Americas that participate, that it's noticeably something that's repeated, but yet not reflected on traditional DNA studies unless you go further into the GED match. Now, what I will tell you is that it's not a surprise for those of us that use GED match because we do see the Iberian, we see the West Asian markers. It's just that in my earlier studies of population genetics and patterns with our people, I'm not going to lie to you, I blew off West Asian markers. Okay, I blew those off because if I saw 1%, and those tiny markers, I didn't think it was worthy of my time to investigate that. But that was a big mistake because once I started looking at people from West Africa or some of my matches, because many people in your listening audience know that my father is Ghanaian. So I have plenty of matches to compare, and Africans are participating in these DNA studies, despite the fact that some people think they aren't, which is good because it gives us a basis for comparison. So when I start looking at many of the West African samples, and of course that depends what part of West Africa they come from, but let's say many of the samples from my father's country of Ghana, they're not showing the West Asian matches. They're not showing it. And occasionally you may see a little bit, but it would be less than ours. But for the most part, they will not show those kind of markers. So evidently there's a pattern. And that is what I want the listening audience to pay attention to. Look at the patterns.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. That's
There's something else.
okay. We have like 1 minute, so if you can wrap up in about 45 seconds, that would be great.
Okay, so okay. Now that I have to wrap it up, let me say it. When you look at archaeogenetics and ancient DNA, and they're comparing it to our DNA, it's very important to look at population distance. Okay, so the closer the match, the more confident they are, and that also suggests either you are that individual or you two, the two populations intermixed so heavily, you almost became one. One of the things that I noticed in the archaeogenetics in another group called sequencing, which is also another archaeogenetic sites, we match closest to Khoisan. So we know that our base DNA is a Khoisan type of DNA, not necessarily from South Africa, but there was a heavy Khoisan presence here. And I don't have time to get into it. But the second group we matched closest.
We are out of time, unfortunately. But I thank you so much, and we'll definitely have to do that again. And it's very interesting that you mentioned the Khoisan, because in the folklore and every um, Aboriginal and in a Native American folklore, it talks about the little people who were the forebears of the Native Americans. So, but on that note, we're going to have to stop. And folks, I know it was just getting hot, but there will be another time, okay? And we will bring the doctor back on. So until the next time, I'm gonna sign off and say, "Do da da go hon e."
I surrender, I surrender.
All right, pal. Get ready for the day, buddy.
Hey, Dad. Hey, Dad. Do we have a gun?
What's that?
Do we have a gun?
Did you see that? Whoa, we scored?
Yeah, we scored. We're going to the playoffs.